Hi, everybody. So thank you so much for joining us for our event today. We might just give people a few minutes to trickle in before we get started, but we're very excited to have you. I'm Dr. Michelle Teo with Zevo Health, and I'll sort of be the host for today's online session. Just in terms of order of the day, I've got with me my panelists here. So we'll be starting with our panel discussion. And then what we'll be doing is moving into a one-to-one discussion with another speaker. So if anyone has any questions while we're kind of talking amongst ourselves, feel free to use the chat function. We'll have a moderator kind of reviewing the chat as we're going through the talks, and we'll have time at the end of the entire online session today to respond to your questions that have come in through the chat. And if we have a bit of time, any kind of live questions that maybe come in. All right. So I think we've got most people here now, which is great. So I'm really excited to start us off with a wonderful panel discussion to explore sort of cross-discipline perspective. This is a sort of growing discussion within the TNS industry of the need to sort of protect our content moderators through a more holistic approach, including perspectives and inputs from different functions like policy, tooling, consultancy, and more. So with my panelists today, we're going to be exploring moderator well-being from all of those different lenses. So just by way of introduction, with me today, I have Dr. Pamela Lennon, who is one of my colleagues. She acts as the Senior Wellbeing Consultant in Zevo Health. And Pam has extensive experience engaging with key stakeholders in the TNS industry, including moderators directly, their management teams and their support functions, and then company well-being POCs through our consultancy offerings. So she conducts really in-depth analyses of key factors that pose psychosocial risks to content moderator well-being. I also have with me Susanna Fisher, who is an expert in TNS policy development. So she has worked in the industry since 2017, running global policy orgs for multiple industry-leading vendors in the content moderation space. So her work has encompassed policies relating to fraud, child safety, e-commerce, and more. And she has experienced firsthand how policy functions can impact moderator well-being. And last but not least, we have Yulan from CheckStep, and she is the head of product there. So for any of those who don't know, CheckStep is a B2B SaaS scale-up building TNS moderation and compliance solutions to help platforms dealing with harmful behavior and content. And prior to working at CheckStep, she was a data scientist at Meta and has covered topics including network-based detection, including counterterrorism, suicide and self-injury, as well as customer support and advertising. So thank you to all my lovely panelists. So I guess to start us off, this is a question for all of our panelists, just very broadly speaking. Are there any gaps that you currently see in your respective roles when it comes to addressing moderator well-being? And I might just start off with Pam.
Hi, everyone. One of the key findings that I see is that there's a primary focus on individual resilience in content moderators in organizations. And also that there's kind of a territory focus, okay, someone may be experiencing VT, we need to provide them with counseling. And there's less of a focus on maybe preventative measures that the organization or the company can provide. So there are so many different psychosocial stressors that can have an impact even greater than that of reviewing the content, and can predict, psychological impacts on well-being as well. So thinking of things that I commonly see, like high work demands, having a lot of daily quotas, or even high performance expectations as well. And all of these contribute to cognitive overload and high pressure, and probably take away from that time to really, process some of the difficult content and maybe viewing and taking time for self-care. So the focus is on constantly reviewing content without taking into consideration that human factor and the psychological impact as well. And there's so many different psychosocial factors dependent on each organization. They're all different, but it's something to really consider beyond the content itself, to focus on to protect content moderators.
Great. Yulan, do you have any thoughts yourself?
Yes, for me it's a bit a different angle as a company building a product and having been like heavily involved in the tech side. What I can see that is a bit the limiting factor and a gap is resource constraints. For smaller to medium-sized platforms, already having a trust and safety function is not easy in terms of budget and resources. Very often, like companies who start their core business is not trust and safety. They're a streaming platform, they're a messaging platform, and so there's already that. And definitely now with the regulations coming out in Europe and the UK, these companies are slapped with other things on their mind that they need to take care of. So there's that, and then on the other aspect with the bigger companies, they often rely on BPOs for outsourcing, and they rely on those companies to ensure the well-being. So this is what I can see a bit more from the platform side being a bit of a gap, or I would say a blocker.
Okay. And Susanna, yourself, any thoughts on the policy side?
Yes. So on the policy side, I think that one of the little bit of a gap that we see sometimes is assumptions around which policies are creating the most wellness impact. Like we all know that there are some really awful pieces of content out there, and there are policies that speak to those things. But the assumption is that we treat policies as like a monolith, and we assume that a particular policy will affect everyone in the same way, which is not necessarily true. Humans are individual, we have individual preferences, we also have individual levels of resiliency for certain types of content. So making decisions in policy around this policy is always, or this type of content is always bad and always impactful, it doesn't take into account some of the individualities or uniquenesses of the moderators that are actually working on this content. What affects you really deeply may be something that I'm able to compartmentalize or just work my way through. So we lack an understanding of how to treat the impacts of policy at an individual level, I think, to some extent.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of food for thought there from a lot of different angles when we're considering where the gaps are. So Yulan, as head of product at CheckStep, what types of developments do you maybe see tooling companies need to explore that focuses more on enhancing moderator well-being rather than maybe simply mitigating the risk of exposure?
Yes, yes. So yeah, when we talk about moderator well-being within tooling, very often the first thought is limiting the impact, which we're well aware of, blurring, grayscaling, putting videos into frames. But actually, I would say that prevention is the best, is usually the best solution. So very often it's having that conversation with the platform. Some of the platforms that we work with, they really want to protect their moderators by being better safe than sorry. And so if the AI thinks that this is likely to be something very gore or graphic, rather take it down than have a moderator actually have to look at it. So that's one aspect, and this really depends on the platform, on the risk versus the safety that they want to take. The second thing is that in a way that platforms measure platform health by number of pieces of content taken down or scanned or numbers of user report. The same way it can be done with well-being. Like well-being of moderators can be measured. Think of a sort of net promoter score in retail or a customer satisfaction score, where moderators can like either daily or weekly just fill in a very short quiz, and this data over time and enough volume can actually be used to understand whether well-being is improving or not. Another benefit to having that type of measurement is that you can make it actionable as a platform. In order to make it actionable, you can measure where most of the well-being score is dropping points, if you want to put it in that way, and then identify what can be done. Maybe it's a couple key policies, maybe it's a couple of regions or languages where moderators are really having a harder time. And then different types of actions can be taken, spreading the distribution of very harmful content or difficult or mentally very hard content, together with some softer, more benign content. Make sure that moderators can rotate. So having measurement really allows for targeted actioning. And then I think the last point that you can do that we can do as a tooling company and as an industry is also measure the impact that it has on the bottom line, because
Mm.
companies care about people and companies care about their bottom line. This is the way businesses work. And if there's a way to show that improved well-being reduces churn, for example, reduces the amount of mistakes made, it's a win-win for everyone. And that's like, some of that measurement should really be in place to prove that it also impacts the company and makes the company better overall and creates more user safety.
Yeah, that's really great. Susanna, I know that policy veers away from tooling in some respects, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on that also.
I do. I really want to build off of Yulan's point about distributing content in a intentional and like meaningful way. I think that this is a really great opportunity for cross-functional collaboration, aligned to what I said earlier about understanding the impacts of different policies on different people. Um, it's always good not to see the same type of content all day long, especially if it's something that is egregious or potentially unsettling. However, if we did have more insight, partnering with our policy teams and partnering with our wellness teams to create some sort of screening or assessment of resiliency on different types of content, we could move from like a random distribution to a more considered distribution to say, these people are extremely resilient in this area. They shouldn't see this type of content all day, every day, but they can take a little more of our content load here, and we should avoid this particular type of content being routed towards them because this is a trigger point for them. That's like a 3-part process that, you know, we would need to have people in place that are experts in wellness and knowing how to assess people's resiliency levels and put that into an actionable recommendation for what types of content they should be seeing and how often. But I do think that if you could have those different functions collaborate, then our product and our tooling teams, like the ones Yulan is used to running, they could help us be really, really intentional about who's seeing what and when and how often.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, you know, just initial discussion here, even just about us cross discipline, just talking to each other more and learning from each other more. So moving sort of more into the policy side then, Pam, you know, in your experience speaking to moderators and their sort of support functions, have you gleaned any insights into how policy teams could better support moderators' well-being?
Yeah, essentially to be as clear and concise as possible, if possible. You know, often in our focus groups, it crops up that trying to adhere to complex, ambiguous policy can be an additional stressor while trying to meet their quotas and quality standards. And other factors such as, you know, where the policy is being developed. For example, if it's developed in the US, are there cultural difference in understanding and adhering to policy, say in EMEA or the UK, for example? And also if, you know, the policy is constantly being updated and it's coming from multiple channels, that obviously leads to, you know, increased stress and, you know, pushing more towards burnout if there are other demands there as well. And often a demand on content moderators is if, you know, the decisions in policy don't align with their own personal values and they kind of have to go against the grain, or if in some way they relate to the material that they're moderating as well. So that can be, I think, a tricky one for teams to navigate. But I think if, you know, updates are delivered in a single channel, or you know, just a consideration for anything that could be ambiguous or confused as well, you know, particularly in a global platform as well. So there are just some things I've found, yeah.
Yeah, and Susanna, I know yourself and myself have spoken extensively about these kind of pieces. But in terms of any maybe major gaps in policy development that impact moderator well-being, is there anything that you think that companies could be addressing immediately?
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to say I love all of Pam's comments. Those are so near and dear to my heart in all the work I've done with content moderators and the conversations I've had where you think they're going to tell you how terrible the content is, and it doesn't come up sometimes. It's all about, I had to take this decision and I felt really bad about it, but the policy said it's the right thing. So thank you for highlighting all of those. Those are all excellent points. From a process related standpoint, one thing that I think that we don't always do a very good job of in policy development teams is consulting the people who are going to be implementing the policies we create early on in the process. This is being done across the industry, but with varying degrees of consistency and at varying stages within the process of developing and rolling out policies. It becomes a little bit more complicated even because the teams that are maybe better equipped to do this, which are smaller platforms where you have a centralized policy development team who own every policy update that gets rolled out through their platforms, they're a little bit better equipped, but they also may not have the bandwidth. Having centralized owners means that you can control that conversation a little bit better with your moderators, but you may not have the time or the resources. Like Yulan was mentioning earlier, there's competing priorities all the time. And if you're developing a policy that is related to a real world event that occurred, you may value speed over feedback. The larger platforms have more, I guess, robust policy development teams quite often, to where different expert SME individuals own developing different pieces of their policy. That's wonderful, but it's a little harder to concentrate on how those many moving pieces seek feedback from the moderators who are going to be using them. In my opinion, the earlier you can involve the people moderating your policy, the better. For one, they're seeing the content on a daily basis, thousands of pieces of the content that you want this policy to be applied to. So while we may sometimes be working in the theoretical, they are working in the very realistic, very grounded world of pieces of content. So having them come in early allows you to catch maybe any gaps that were missed in developing that policy, something that may be glaringly obvious to someone who sees 5,000 pieces of content a day that someone like me might miss. It also helps to get that buy-in. Like we were talking about, the stress comes at some points from saying, I don't understand this policy, I don't know why the policy is the way it is, or I don't personally agree with this policy. Having feedback earlier on in that development process helps build the buy-in of the moderators to feel, I know why these changes are happening, I know how to apply them, and even if I don't agree with them, I understand the perspective of how it fits into the company's operations. So the sooner we can get the moderators themselves involved in the feedback loop, the better.
That's I think a really great point. And Yulan, I wonder if you have any sort of additional thoughts.
Yes, I really second the cross-functional collaboration between policy and moderators. I would actually say the same goes for the product team. Having the moderators and the policy team together write the operational guidelines is helpful for the product team, who will have to build the AI classifier, and they might also be like, oh, this is actually not very clear, we can't really build a classifier that will make a distinction between this thing that is very similar to that other thing. So that's really helpful feedback to avoid then having content that is vague being shown to moderators, and then the moderators not really knowing what to do. The second thing, and maybe a bit less about the content side, but more about their workflow, is that what we've seen from our development is that having a feedback loop with moderators has been so useful in when we add new product features where they go like, oh, this actually looks great, but it means that I have to click twice now to get to the same information. And their recommendations have been really useful to still get to the goal where we wanted to go of adding some extra piece of information without adding to their workflow. So I do think that three-way communication with policy, the moderation, and the operations team and the tech team is super important.
Yeah, and I think that actually, oh, sorry, go ahead, Susanna.
Add one more thing. I was thinking about it. I always like to think about multiple perspectives, right? Like just because I say it's a good idea doesn't mean everybody's going to think it's a good idea. And one of the like sort of pushbacks or hesitations I can imagine people saying when they hear Yulan and I speak about this is it takes too much time or it costs us money to lengthen this cycle. And I would want to encourage people who feel that way to consider whether it takes more time at the front end of the process to prevent an issue or more time at the back end of the process to fix an issue. So for example, if you're rolling out, like Yulan was saying, if it takes 2 clicks, I would rather someone tell me that in a feedback group or in a feedback loop before I launched it live than having 2,000 moderators now spending their time double clicking for as long as it takes us to get that feedback and come up with a solution. That's time that could have been prevented from being wasted. Same thing with a policy. If I had someone come and tell me early, this policy doesn't work because this is the type of content we really see on a day-to-day basis, that could prevent hundreds or thousands of incorrect actions that would happen, where you then run the risk of PR issues or wellness issues or having to find resources to fix a problem that you didn't expect. So I know that it feels like you're adding more work or more time or more money, but I would really encourage people to think about, is it worth it to add a little here to avoid a lot later?
Yeah, and do you know what? I think that's a really key point. You know, a lot of us operate in a B2B environment, so we are, even as Yulan mentioned at the very beginning of this panel, we're concerned about the bottom line, right? So what is that potential return on investment for you if you engage your moderators at the start of the journey rather than halfway and then have to go back and fix issues and possibly spend even more money? So it's a really great point, I think, from both of you, and I really appreciate you kind of bringing that up to our audience today. The last piece we're kind of looking at then, I suppose, is the consultancy side of things. So Pam, are there any sort of key areas outside of policy and tooling that you've seen present as a sort of psychosocial risk to moderators through your work?
Yeah, just to say, I loved what Susanna and Yulan said there about, you know, engaging people who actually work with policy and tooling and getting that 360 feedback, because they're the ones that know how it's working or maybe have insight into how clients are experiencing or having any issues as well. And also, tooling and policy can be a resource or it can be a psychosocial stressor. You know, it can either benefit the content moderator or deter from their productivity and their well-being as well. But there are, what I see crop up most is, you know, high performance expectations and high work demands, you know, thinking of moderators from a process-oriented perspective instead of a human-centric perspective, you know, understanding human motivations, how to sustain productivity and motivation as well, instead of constantly reaching targets. And if performance expectations are too high, it can deter, I've seen it deter content moderators' motivation, you know, and they feel down and less energetic and less motivated as well. So I think from an organizational perspective, you know, you want to reduce burnout. You don't want to have high staff turnover. You don't want to have absenteeism or presenteeism. So as Susanna and Yulan were saying, it makes sense to kind of really be preventative and supportive from the outset to reduce, you know, costs, you know, after that. But some of the other ones, again, duration of exposure to content. It's good, as Susanna was saying, to switch around to change the type of content you're exposed to, particularly egregious content. Of course, some people prefer some content compared to others, or can deal with some of the difficult material better. And of course, working from home in isolation, you know, not having that social connection with others as much anymore, and having to deal with this psychologically demanding work without, you know, having that immediate contact or debriefing, or, you know, working shift work hours as well, working the graveyard shift. It can, impact people engaging with their families and friends and stuff. So that's so important as a resource to have that social contact as well. But I suppose psychosocial stressors vary from organization, and there's endless list of things that can potentially add to a content moderator's, you know, day-to-day work of trying to, you know, do their job, removing, you know, certain content as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's it sort of parallels how we think about the users. You know, there's a whole bunch of different ways that they could be put at risk if we don't have all of the guardrails in place to remove that content or to proactively kind of make sure that it doesn't even end up on the platform in the first place. And the same kind of speaks to content moderators, that there's a whole host of different risk factors that are possibly going to impact their well-being, and we need to be a little bit more proactive and a little bit more, we're considering, you know, how we address their needs. So I suppose a final question for our group of panel here, coming from these very different sort of disciplines. What do we feel the trust and safety community needs overall to sort of level up in safeguarding our moderators' well-being? And maybe I'll start with you, Lan.
Yeah, sure. I actually, if I can, I just wanted to actually say something on what Pamela said around treating moderators as human beings. And in a way, their job is incredibly hard. And what I've seen from my experience is actually also feeding back to them the impact that they've had is super rewarding. Like in some of the teams I worked with at Facebook, where we prevented really bad things from happening because a moderator was quick enough to make the right assessment, and then feeding back that they've actually prevented that, it's super empowering. And I think it's very important to also make sure that they understand that the hard work they're doing is actually reaping a lot of benefits and creating lots of safety. But then in order to get there, to get back to Michelle's question about what we need as an industry to level up, like I'm a product technical person, so for me it's really like being able to measure the impact. If we can show as an industry that well-being improves the bottom line, I think that's something that we really need to level up in, is like piecing these together. And then accountability. I think if companies outsource, they need to be able to hold the outsourcing companies also accountable. And some ways that I'm thinking about is maybe certifications or some well-being standards, which leads me actually more to the third topic, is having a common language. I think now in the industry, when we talk with platforms, people go like, oh, but what's the AI accuracy? And everyone knows now what is AI accuracy. But I wish that there was some similar jargon or vocabulary to talk about the moderator well-being.
That's really great. Yeah. Susanna, any thoughts on your side?
Well, as a policy person, I know everyone is going to expect me to say clearer, unambiguous policies, things like this, but I'm going to take a left turn here. And I'm going to say a word that is perhaps a dirty word in some people's vocabulary. But I want to talk a little bit about transparency. We are, Michelle's excited. We are in a time right now where transparency is a huge buzzword and a hot topic. And people are talking about transparency reporting, transparency requirements. What do we provide to stakeholders? What do we provide to the public? But what that discussion hasn't really encompassed has been wellness efforts. It's talked about what have we actioned, what have we not actioned, how have we interacted with other organizations and governments and things like that, which is fantastic. But I would love to see in the future us live in a place where wellness was part of our transparency reporting, where we say as platforms, we took these actions, we made these changes to safeguard the well-being of our content moderators. I think that would establish a certain level of confidence in a platform, and it would also help different platforms learn from one another. That's the second part of it, right, is that conversations need to be normalized and regularized. So conversations like this are a really great start, where we have different people from different organizations and different functions. It's fantastic. But I would love to see things like this be the norm, a regular meeting, a coalition of some kind, where people are actively sharing best practices and learning from one another, and just taking away those things to go and help in their wellness efforts. That can be done a lot easier if, like Yulan was talking about, we have a common language to talk about it. If you've ever spoken in a conversation with someone who speaks a different language than you, you might get about half of what they say. You might get the gist of it, but can you really find the library if you asked? Probably not. So having that common language, I think, is a first step to lead to these enhanced conversations and collaborations across the industry.
Pam, I think you want to jump in there, do you?
Me, sorry. Yeah, I just absolutely agree there as well. And I think it just, even this conversation, which is cross-discipline collaboration as well, that opportunity to try, I suppose we all have different languages, you know, someone who's a mental health professional, someone in product development, content moderator as well. So it can be quite technical language to learn as well, but it's so important to, as Susanna was saying, get together to try and look at it from a more preventative, proactive perspective as well, instead of treating the damage that may be done in an area that's rapidly expanding and developing, and technology, Yolanda, is never ending in terms of expansion as well. So just to end on that point.
Yeah, that's really great. And I think, you know, we can see that there are organizations and companies that are trying to kind of enhance that community aspect of it, and us kind of learning from each other. You know, the Trust and Safety Professional Association, we probably all know very well. You know, they have a research branch called the Trust and Safety Foundation, and they're currently driving a research collaborative between content moderators, researchers, academics, and civil society. So, you know, it's a great starting point for us to kind of get together in the industry and learn from one another, and not continue to be so siloed and keeping things very sort of close to our chest and being worried about our competitors, and just taking that really holistic community view and saying we have the same common goal, let's move towards it together.
Absolutely.
So that's all of the questions that we had for the panel today. I just really wanted to thank you all again, Susanna, Yulan, Pam, for joining us. Really appreciate all of your thoughts and insights. So what we're going to do now is have our panelists come off the studio, and then have one of our guest speakers join us for a one-to-one chat. So if you bear with us just for a minute here. Wellbeing specialist for Zevo Health. So Tomas currently leads a multidisciplinary team of mental health professionals who deliver Zevo Health's remote and on-site trust and safety wellbeing programs for various clients. And prior to this, he was on the front lines working directly with content moderators, engaging with them through our counseling services, our group interventions, and all of our training and education workshops. So by trade, Tomas is a behavioral psychologist, and he also has a background in HR, which really rounds out his experience and his kind of qualifications. And with his sort of wealth of experience and his subject matter of safety, I'm really excited to ask him a few questions about how we can support content moderators when geopolitical events occur, such as the current Israel-Hamas conflict. So welcome to the stage, Tomas.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And hi, everyone that's watching as well.
Perfect. So first question for you, Tomas. You have extensive experience on the front lines working with content moderators who respond to increases in user-generated content when geopolitical events like the Israel-Hamas conflict occur. So could you share with our audience what types of impact this is having on content moderators based on what you're currently seeing?
Sure. One thing that we have to bear in mind is that people, the trust and safety professionals and the moderators itself, they are affected by everything that's happening in the world. So it's important for us to take into consideration that whatever is happening in the world, it could be war conflicts, it could be situations that I can give you as example, like the Ukrainian-Russian war, the New Zealand shooting, and then the pandemic as well that we experienced a few years ago, and something that constantly we have content about that as well. So one thing that we need to remember, that whatever is happening in the world, there is going to be a lot of content over the internet in all the platforms, and then people will talk about it, and automatically this will go to the content moderators for them to moderate that content, and that can be something quite challenging. So taking that into consideration, imagine that the content is already quite difficult in general. But for people that has in some way a connection to what's happening in that specific country or in that specific subject, there is an extra layer of impact, of stress for those moderators. So it is very important to take that into consideration, that the content itself is already challenging. But then if that moderator or that group of moderators has in some way a connection or a relationship with that country or with that subject, it is something that will be even more challenging for them specifically. So, for example, if the moderators have specific cultural backgrounds, then the war conflict can affect them directly, even more than someone that doesn't have that cultural background. So, as I said, the content itself is already challenging, but then if there is that cultural background side, it can be even more. It can be that extra layer. So the impact is not only based on the content itself, but also where the content is coming from and the potential safety risks involved on the people that the moderators feel close to. So they might feel, they might see a content from their home country, and then, so it's the content itself plus worrying about their families, worry about their loved ones that are where that content is coming from. So it's important for us to take that into consideration, that the impact is not just the content itself, but that extra layer that can affect specifically some moderators based on where they're from or their cultural background and so on.
Okay, so that personal connection that you're speaking about, I suppose that's extremely relevant when we're considering supports for moderators during geopolitical events. So what do you believe is the best approach when working with moderators who have a personal connection to the events that they're viewing through their work?
So one thing that we always have to take into consideration when working with content moderators and in all ourselves as mental health professionals, prevention is extremely important. That's actually the primary care. That's where we will actually try to do the well-being support to prevent the content moderator to have the harder impacts based on what they see. So prevention is for sure the first thing that we have to take into consideration, and that's something that we do at CIVO. So we don't think about, okay, when the impact is there for that specific person, then we will act. We will always act before. Okay, so that being said, if the event occurs that there is an impact, there is something being facing the challenge of that specific content, that could be general from that content or specifically what I said in my previous answer. So we won't bombard them with well-being support. We will open that space for them. We will be available in a group setting or in a one-to-one setting to provide that space that the content moderators would feel comfortable to come to us and to use the service based on whatever challenges that they are having. So it's pretty much, we will access their needs. So that's where we will know what is the support they need. So it's not just to have the space, it's even more than that. So we will have the space, but then we will also try to understand what they need. So it's important for the employers then to also be sensitive and support their staff by giving them the time to process the events and be in touch with their community. So we will do that, the well-being support, the mental health side of it, but then it's important for the employers as well to remember that their staff are being affected by the content in some way, and also to provide themselves that space for them to process what's happening.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying here really is that having that initial foundation of well-being supports available to your content moderators already helps to mitigate some of the risk. But when a specific event occurs that might result in that sort of personal connection and that increased or added layer of stress that giving them even just space to talk about it and not necessarily bombarding them with a whole host of trainings and self-help resources and everything else, just offering them time and a little bit of extra sensitivity can be really beneficial to their well-being.
Exactly.
So with this conflict and even other similar sort of geopolitical events in previous years, Zevo has looked to kind of proactively reach out to our clients to offer additional supports to specific groups of moderators that we envisage would be impacted either personally or through the content that they're viewing. So could you provide some insight to our audience about how moderators have been actually engaging with these services, perhaps what they've found most useful and meaningful, or any feedback they've provided about what hasn't been useful to them?
One thing that we noticed, and I've been noticing for the past few years that I'm working in the trust and safety environment, is that they will always appreciate the support. So as soon as they know the support is available, that we are there, that space is provided, independently of the stressful events or not. So one thing that I've noticed, and talking with my colleagues, something that we notice at Zevo, is that the content moderators will always appreciate and be grateful for that support. And also something that is quite important to remember as well, as some people, they might not feel comfortable, or they might feel that they don't need to use that support. But even those people that sometimes might choose their social environment, friends, family, for that support, they will come to us and say that they are grateful that the support is also there in the workplace and that's available for them. So regardless if they are using or they're not using the service, one thing that's across the board that we notice is that they will feel appreciated and grateful. So from a perspective of human behaviors, for the ones that do use the service, the feedback is often very positive, and they do come to us saying that it does have an impact on their well-being. So it does make a difference to have that support system inside the workplace, in coming from us in the mental health service as well.
I think you raise a really good point there, in that not every single moderator is going to want to engage in the services that are provided by their mental health provider in the workplace. Sometimes they will prefer to kind of go to friends and family for that support, but it's still important that the space is available to them, and that they have the option, that we're not mandating that people have to attend our services, but that we're giving them the option to have that autonomy to choose what they feel is best for them. So I think that's a really important point that you've brought up there, Tomas.
Yeah, and it's 100%. And as I said, we do have feedback from them as well. That they will say, okay, even though I'm not using the service, I appreciate it that it's available for me. Yeah. So which is really interesting to see as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a psychologist perspective, it's always interesting to get feedback about people who aren't engaging with services, right?
Exactly.
So my final question relates to your current role as a leader to mental health professionals who are supporting moderators through these difficult experiences. So there are actually quite a lot of parallels between your role as a people manager of individuals who are secondarily exposed to difficult content. So our mental health professionals who have to sit across from moderators and understand what their challenges are. And it has that parallel with the trust and safety managers who are leading moderators who are exposed to those similar sort of experiences. So is there any advice that you might give to TNS managers who want to ensure that they're caring for the well-being of their moderation teams during these times of conflict?
Yes, that's a very good question, Michelle, because the managers, even though they're not seeing content, they are there in the environment as well. And they do need to support their staff, because, and one way to do it, one advice that I give to the managers, to the leads in the field, is to show that they care, to be there for their staff the staff that are actually seeing the content, to be there for them and to show that they are aware that the content can be difficult and challenging, and show them like, I am here if you need anything, I care. And one thing, like, to be more practical on what they can do, regardless if they are mental health professionals or not, is to do well-being check-ins. It's pretty much going to their desks and say, hey, how are you doing? Is there anything you need? How is the content impacting you? Is there anything you need support from me? So for the managers to actually do, as I said again, with regardless if they are mental health professionals, to show that they care and to do those check-ins is extremely important. And also important, as I often say, is for their managers to mind themselves as well, because even though they're not seeing the content, they are working in that environment, and it is extremely important for them to mind themselves and to be there and asking for support to process their thoughts, their emotions, and also if they have a well-being service in the workplace, to actually seek for support for how to support their employees. So it's both ways. They need to look at themselves to get the support themselves, and also to get advices and some skills and some techniques to support their staff as well.
So just off the back of that piece, actually, there may be TNS managers who maybe don't have access to mental health services as part of their work. So are there other resources that maybe they could go to if they don't actually have, a counselor or a psychologist that they could talk to during their working hours?
Well, the ideal scenario is that all trust and safety professionals have that support available. So that's the ideal scenario. But we know it might not be the reality. So I would suggest the leads to request it. So to request that support if they don't have it, because that's the ideal scenario, that they would have it, okay, for themselves and for their teams. But that being said, it's very important for managers to have well-being support in some way, even if it's externally based pretty much on the support they provide to their teams themselves. So it is important for them to have that support also. And that could be private therapy, community mental health services, and AIP. So that could be the external support if they don't have in the workplace. So even though they might not be exposed to the content, they may deal with escalations, and they would need to provide support to their teams. And the way to do that is also to have that support themselves and to be equipped to do that. As I said, ideally in the workplace, but if they don't have it, I would highly suggest for any managers and any trust and safety professional to even seek the support externally and to have that available.
Yeah, I think that's really great, Tomas. It's really great advice, I think, for the managers out there and also for other trust and safety professionals. We previously just spoke to people in product and also in policy. So, do they have well-being supports available to them? Maybe something to consider. So really appreciate the time you've taken today, Tomas, to just help sort of inform our audience a little bit more about how we can support moderators when these geopolitical events occur. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invite.
Great. So we're just going to take a few minutes now to bring back our panelists. And what we'll do is, if there are any chat comments or any sort of questions that have come through the chat, I'll let my colleague Charmaine call out any of those questions, and we can start to respond to them once our panelists are back in here, okay?
Great. We had some questions come through, so I'm just going to read out the questions for our panel. Thank you guys so much. That was brilliant. I was listening in, and it was the most fantastic panel, I think, having to listen to. So I'm going to start off with a question from our comments. We had a few earlier on, so I'll start with one. What unique practices do you recommend for AI work, red teaming, etc.?
I don't know if maybe Yulan, this is maybe in your area.
I was thinking that maybe less the red teaming, but the AI work. I think the question is quite broad, so like I don't fully understand what direction you want to go there, but I assume within the moderation space. And I think we briefly talked about it in terms of making sure that there's that 360 feedback loop between all the different stakeholders to develop the AI, because the AI is just a tool to scale the work that we do. Oh yeah, for content moderation protection. Okay. So a couple different angles there is like the AI that is developed to detect content. We can work together to make sure that it only detects what it needs and doesn't overload the moderator with like content that is not relevant. But then there's some other things that we see, and some of these are already implemented today, is that we can just also use the AI to help the moderator pinpoint where they can go and have a look. For example, if it's a long format video, rather than having to go through the whole thing, we can transcribe the video to text, highlight the word that might be the words that are triggering, and make sure that they only have to go through the pieces of a video, for example, where their eyes and their context is needed. In terms of red teaming, I don't have that much experience, so I can't really comment on that.
I suppose as a well-being provider, we wouldn't necessarily have experience in red teaming ourselves, but I guess my understanding of the concept, you know, a lot of what we discussed in the panel, and then also I think in the one-on-one with Tomas, was that kind of cross-discipline collaboration. So, you know, your red team is in place for a certain reason. You know, they're trying to ensure that they're safeguarding the users, but getting input from other content moderators who have that sort of on the ground experience can really help, I think, possibly with your red teams to help them understand what the potential risks are that you're trying to mitigate. And I suppose like content moderators really at the end of the day are our subject matter experts, right? So the policy teams are always great because they're sitting at the top. They're ensuring that they have all of the right information that they need to ensure that they're safeguarding the platforms and the users or the players in sort of gaming industries. But it is that sort of top-down process. Whereas from a content moderator perspective, we're going bottom up, which works maybe a little bit better because they can tell us exactly what it is that works and what doesn't work. And that might be able to apply to kind of red teaming also, with my very sort of limited understanding of what's involved in those kind of practices.
Great. I might move on to the second question. I'm quite aware that we're running short on time. What do you see as the future trends in content moderation, especially in terms of technology and approaches to improve well-being?
I think from my perspective, there's a lot of conversation around sort of AI at the moment. You know, it's the big hot topic of the day in technology, and there's discussions around using AI for health outcomes, right? And there are already sort of businesses who are looking to use AI to track data, health data, and to sort of identify whether or not someone is in a vulnerable place or in a vulnerable state based on the data that they're tracking. The sort of concerns, I think, from a lot of the researchers and academics in this side of the house is around the sort of data protection side of things. So, you know, is it okay for us to be tracking all of this health data and then using that information in some way to target someone who's maybe a little bit vulnerable and needs additional supports? So it's around sort of privacy agreements and terms and conditions when it comes to that. But then I think the other consideration, maybe just from that human perspective, is if I have AI chatbots that are responding to individuals who are potentially at a little bit of risk clinically, do we lose that sort of human element of psychology? You know, there's so much benefit to having a content moderator sit in front of you and tell you in real time what it is that's impacting them. And even if it has nothing to do with the content that they're viewing, even if it's just the operational and the work processes that are around them, for us to be able to take that information, that qualitative information, and feed it back to a client is really, really beneficial, because then changes can be made. It can be done, I suppose, through AI. We can always take that data and analyze it and then send a report back to a client. But there's maybe a sort of just personal factor to it where I'm a bit like, oh, I'd love to keep having that human interaction. And I don't know, Tomas, Pam, if you maybe have thoughts on your side on that also.
Yes, it's very interesting, because it's something that is already out there for a while. About there are even apps for mental health support that are actually an AI that is actually talking to the person, and that can be very challenging, because even though the AI might be very well trained, as Michelle was saying, is not a mental health professional there. So it's quite difficult, because where that conversation is going and how quick it will be for if the person flags that needs support, if the person is at risk. So it is something that it needs to be taken into consideration. And for the content moderators itself, AI can be so quick in actually create things, create images, create texts, that it can go viral. So it's quite difficult as well, thinking on the perspective that those contents are being created, and then the content moderators have to deal with that content. So it's something that it needs to be taken into consideration about the IT companies, the social media, to actually be aware that it is something else besides the content that already is there, that it is content being created in a so fast-paced environment that it's challenging for them to manage and to moderate that content. That needs to be taken into consideration as well, and that's something that we have been seeing.
Yeah, I think just a sort of last point from my perspective is like AI and technology is great. There are a lot of really great benefits to using technology. We've seen over the last sort of 20, 30 years how technology has enabled us to do so much. But I think being tech enabled when it comes to psychological health is maybe a better approach than just going tech heavy and saying that everything is tech related. Like not necessarily just relying on the tech, but having that balance between the human intervention also, I think, is really important.
Great.
So I think that's it for today. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all the time we have for questions. Yeah.
Perfect. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. And thank you once again to our amazing panelists and our speakers. Really, really appreciate you guys taking the time to inform our audience, to share your thoughts and insights. And thank you again.